Welcome, Naomi Shragai, to the Seekers Forum. It's wonderful to see you.
Oh, it's lovely to see you, Mark. Thanks so much for inviting me. It's great to
My,
be here.
when I was thinking about who I wanted to talk to about family trauma and the legacies of wounding within families, I thought of you right away because not only have you lived that in your own personal family, but you've also worked with families, and now you work with people at work around bringing emotional wounding into the workplace. So I feel like you cover the waterfront. I'd like to
Mhm.
start with talking about your upbringing. You are the child of Holocaust survivors. Can you talk a little bit about how that impacts a child? How did that shape you as a kid?
Well, that's right. Both my parents, in fact, survived Auschwitz. My mother from Czechoslovakia and my father from Hungary. They both survived. My father has a sister who survived Auschwitz, but tragically, my mother lost everyone. So after the camp, she was truly, truly on her own. So there was quite a lot of trauma. And just a very quick history, perhaps, just to let you know that both my mother and my father, after surviving, made their way to what was then Palestine, is now Israel, of course, and where they met and married. And my sister and I were born in Israel, and then we emigrated to the US in the 60s. So that just kind of puts you in context about where we are. And when we did live in Israel, in fact, we lived for a good period on a kibbutz. And as you may know, in kibbutz, children live separate from their parents. And at the time, of course, there was quite a lot of poverty in Israel, and my family couldn't survive in the cities. And so we moved to a kibbutz to live. But there was also some, I'm sure, some experience about being separate from our parents, which as a family created its own problems. And so hence we immigrated to America. So I hope that just gives you a context about where we were.
Yes.
But
And
you
so,
asked me another question. I'm sorry, you asked how it affected me as a child. Um, so let's go back. If I go back to my very early years, of course, a child's life always feels normal. They know no other, of course. So it always felt very normal, of course. But my mother was highly, highly, highly anxious. I think she was a lot more damaged than my father from the experience, simply because she hadn't had anybody in her family who survived. The fact that my father had a surviving sister, I think, made a difference. It always seemed somehow that my father was a bit more robust, healthier somehow, but my mother always seemed very damaged. What I mean damaged, she was highly, highly, highly anxious. Basically, she was scared. She was scared all the time. Every time anyone left home, my sister, myself, my father, she was scared. She always imagined that she would lose her family the way she lost her family in the camps. So anytime she couldn't keep an eye, of course, she imagined that they would be gone. And she lived with this terror and this fear constantly. So in her mind, I think she hadn't quite left the camps. So physically, she might have been with us, but in her mind, she was still over there, somewhere she never left. Now, of course, as a child, I didn't understand that she was scared. What I experienced was a mother who was highly anxious and whose anxiety oftentimes turned into anger. She was really impatient. She was quite angry. So somehow I could see she wasn't quite with us. She was quite irrational. There were a lot of odd outbursts. It was a difficult child. It wasn't, these weren't parents who were nurturing or loving. I just felt they were elsewhere. And they scared me. My mother scared me. There were her anxieties. She was scared, and in turn, she scared me. So it was a difficult childhood. And I think as a result, I quite struggled as a child. I, I wasn't good as a child. What can I say? I wasn't good at school. I wasn't good at friendships. I wasn't good at stuff. I, I think I was probably an anxious and depressed child myself.
hmm. And did you ask your parents about their experiences? Did you say, Mom, why are you so anxious? Why are you so scared when you were a young child?
No. I think I think as a child, that was just my world. I didn't question it. I didn't know parents were different. Although I did notice when I went to my friends' homes that everyone spoke English and people spoke the same language. And I thought that was amazing to understand what your parents were talking about. Of course, my parents spoke Hungarian. I never knew, never understood what was going on. So, but other than that, that was just normal. But so I remember just staying a bit clear of her, just a bit clear. I had other interests. I was into animals and horses and things outside of the home. So it was, I guess, more of an escape. So as a child, no, I didn't ask. But as a teenager, I, I knew something was wrong, and I wanted to help her. Of course, I probably wanted to help myself. I didn't realize that at the time. But I wanted to connect with her. I wanted to help her. And I remember intentionally just wanting to calm her. I took her to places that I imagined she loved when she was a child before the war. So I would take her to lovely gardens outside of Los Angeles. I remember Descanso Gardens, lovely garden. And because she loved nature as a child, but of course, because the camps were in nature, she grew to be fearful of nature. So I had to reintroduce her to nature again. And then I took her back to the theater and took her to concerts, and we talked about books. And these were the things she loved as a child. So I tried to connect her back to what she might have loved. And I think she began to heal. And I think she did begin to heal. And I think that, well, I don't think, I'm certain that's why I became a healer. I learned to heal damaged lives as a child, and I never stopped.
I was going to say, you became your mother, you became your mother's therapist in a way as a child.
Yeah, absolutely.
Did you ever blame her or have conflict with her or your father when it came to your personal issues and feeling like you had inherited things from them that were untenable for you to, for you to deal with?
Yes and no. So let me start with the yes. I clearly in my late 20s, no, sorry, late teens, early 20s, sorry, when I was the age that my parents were, yeah, when they were transported to the camps, I started to have unusual experiences. I started to feel unbelievable grief. I mean, it was excruciating. Now, it was inexplicable because I hadn't known anyone who had died in my lifetime. My grandparents, of course, were annihilated all in Auschwitz. And so I never knew anybody who had died, but I felt this unbelievable grief.
At
and
what age are we talking about?
Must have began at around 20. So not far from the age that my mother was when she was deported, and my father. And I also felt this hunger, this painful hunger that eventually ended up in part of severe eating disorder. I became very ill. I mean, I was very, very, very ill in my early 20s, very ill. And somehow in my head, I don't know how I knew this, but I knew I was carrying something of their experience. Now, we have to go back to the 80s, remember. You and I are talking about transmission of trauma, inherited trauma. That's what we're talking about. Nobody was talking about this in the 80s. So I couldn't, I mean, I'm sure I told some friends, but you couldn't find a professional or a psychotherapist to understand that. But somehow I knew that. I knew that I was holding something for them, that I was there, that I was here, but I was there. Simultaneously here and there, I knew it. And it was very life-threatening. I was very, very ill and went to really dark places, to a place where I know that psychiatrists had said to my parents and my family, I was told I'd never live a normal life. I would always be ill. So it was really sick because nobody could quite make sense of the experiences I was having. But I suspected all along that I was carrying something in the family. And indeed I was. I absolutely was. Did I blame my parents? I didn't blame them as such. I was angry that they couldn't understand. I was angry that they couldn't understand. And then later I was angry because remember, if you grew up in a family like mine, where say you're living with your parents' trauma, so there is the trauma that's inherited, something that you carry of theirs, something that is unresolved, unfaced, unspoken, that you hold somewhere in your system. And of course, there's a trauma of being born into and raised by two people who were severely traumatized, if that makes sense.
Right, right.
You know, so there is this and that. And I was angry later, angry about my childhood. And that came much later. That came much later. But it came, and it came.
But it's extraordinary looking back. It seems so obvious that their experience would have impacted you and your sister, and yet that connection wasn't made. How do you explain that?
Well, you know, there's so much we don't understand. I'm sure in, 20, 30, 40 years, we'll have understandings that we don't have today. That's just the course of psychotherapy. So there wasn't that understanding. But keep in mind that people weren't even, in the 80s, people weren't even yet listening to survivors themselves. It was only in the 90s when, I think, following Schindler's List and Steven Spielberg's attempts to interview Holocaust survivors, do people actually listen to their stories? So their stories still haven't been heard. The whole thing hadn't begun to be faced. It took decades and decades and decades. So if their experiences weren't heard and understood, well, the second generation, that was far from being understood, far from it. That came many, many years later. So I always felt like I had to find my own way. And of course I did, but I had to find my own way.
And when you were growing up and you felt this severe anxiety and fear from your mother, were you able to go to your father and tell him what was going on? You say that he wasn't quite as damaged as your mom. Was he able to give you a sense of stability?
Well, yes, he did in the sense. I oftentimes came up to him, when she would when she would be really irrational, because of course, she drove him nuts too. I mean, she was difficult. Well, she was scared all the time. What can I say? So you can imagine how difficult it was. And sometimes irrational. And I would go to him a lot, and he would just raise his hands and say, there's nothing I can do. But I guess an acknowledgement was quite a lot for me. But he wasn't around very much because she was difficult, again, scared. I don't know if a difficult is the right word, scared, highly anxious, difficult. And so he retreated into work. So he wasn't there very much. And it was, sad. There's so many good things to her. And of course, she did get better with years and as she got older. But, just so sad that so much was taken from her, not only her family, but I always felt it was so sad that her experience of mothering was taken from her, that she couldn't enjoy having children because it was just scary. Children were something else that could be taken from her. It wasn't normal. So, what can I say? Hitler continued to take from her.
And is it true that when you would ask her about, well, Mom, why are you like this, that she would say something like, blame Hitler?
Yeah, that's right. I mentioned that to you. Well, yeah, because I go to her and I would say, how can you act like this? This is crazy. And she always said, don't blame me, blame Hitler. And I thought, can't argue with that.
Now, I know that you have a sister and that this impacted her differently. than it did you. I'd like to talk a little bit about how that happens in the same household, the same two parents. One child takes it on in the way that you have, and your sister evolved or adapted differently. Can you talk a little bit about how that works in a family?
Sure. Well, let's talk about Holocaust families. Of course, these things happen in all families, but in these sorts of families, what we talk about today is that Holocaust families tend to have a memorial candle. Memorial candle is a child that tends to carry the experience, was unresolved. So many families like mine, where perhaps both parents are survivors of concentration camps and whatever the configuration might be, it tends to be a child that's identified as memorial candle. And clearly, I was the memorial candle in my family. And oftentimes, it's just the case that the memorial candle has this stuff to process and face. And oftentimes, like myself, never have children because they're busy with that, as I was busy with that most of my life, of course. And then my sister, quite the opposite. I think she was free of that. I mean, it's not so black and white. You have to appreciate it's not so absolutely black and white. But the other sibling oftentimes picks up another role in the family, as my sister did. She had two lovely boys and married and had more of a kind of a traditional life. But certainly I seemed to be the one to feel everything. And she managed not to feel so much. So she became more detached and I became more involved. It's oftentimes the case that siblings and families identify differently. They defend against the trauma differently. What I'm suggesting is that everybody might experience the same trauma in a family, but they all defend against it differently. Mm-hmm. And that was a case in my family, clearly.
So how did you get well? I mean, you said that you went through a period of being very ill. You suffered with eating disorder. I know there was depression. How did you cure? How did you heal from this? From this devastating early experience?
Oh my God, I think I'd have to talk about my life there, but sorry.
Let's do that.
I'll try to condense it all. Well, I can look back, and while I've inherited their trauma, I've inherited other things about my parents because they were great people too. And they gave me that too, which was lovely. And obviously somewhere they're both survivors and so am I. I have a strength in me that I don't know, sometimes I think it's too much. It makes me impatient sometimes with other people. I think, come on, get over it sometimes, because I did. And the first thing I did, of course, like my parents, I guess, like in my family, I fled. I ran, as a runner. And I fled to Europe. At the time, I didn't realize I was running, but I just got on my bike, literally, went to London, Europe to ride a bike, literally, and never came back. So I ran. That was the first thing I did, is I took I wouldn't have planned it that way at the time. I just, probably didn't think that much, but I did run. And I was a runner and I was very busy running, reinventing, trying to distance myself really from everything. So there was an attempt always to get further and further and further away. And certainly coming to England, where I am now, I'm in London, that's where I'm talking to you from. I've been here for a long, long time. But of course, it couldn't be further from my background. I have no ties. I had no ties in England. I had known anyone. How I ended up here is I could only explain as an attempt to get far away. And then, from there, once I had the distance, what can I say? I tried everything. I knew I was confused. I knew I wasn't well. I knew there were things I needed to face. I knew that nobody would quite understand this particular experience, not then, perhaps now, but certainly not then. I think some of the more profound experiences I had, I remember once, of all people, a craniosteopath, a very kind craniosteopath who was deeply intuitive, put his hands on me and just said, whatever's in your body is not yours. And it's the first time I heard that from another person, this is not yours. that was so powerful for me
Mm.
to hear it. Somebody acknowledged that. And he went on. And in fact, he suggested I really not go to psychotherapy, so much so that it wasn't mine. And he encouraged me in other
I'm sorry,
ways.
say that. I'm sorry, say that again. He encouraged you not to go to psychotherapy?
Not to go to psychotherapy, which is actually the right thing to say at the time. So let me explain. I understood what he meant, of course, and I know it sounds very odd. First of all, psychotherapy at the time really didn't understand how trauma was inherited.
Mm.
There wasn't that understanding.
Mm.
You know, I'm a psychotherapist now, but at the time, psychotherapists, I think, didn't appreciate the impact on the body and what the body held, but he knew that. He knew that this was in my body, and I knew it was in my body. And so I began, so what I did is I learned and later trained to teach the Alexander technique, which I knew I needed to heal something in my body, which is where it was held. I just knew this intuitively. I can't really explain it. I just knew, and it was indeed the right course for me to take. And meditation has played an enormous part for me in just, I think, just in eliminating the stress, the historic stress. You know, meditation has been a huge part of my life for, I don't know, more than 30 years, 35 years, huge part of my life. And then, you know, there were things I was able to face in therapy, such as the trauma of, I guess, the experience of what it was like growing up in my family and the impact it had on me. And I had things to deal with because my mother was scary, so I was scared of people, and I was certainly scared of intimacy. That was for sure. I really fled from that. I fled from a lot of things, actually. Fled and fled and fled. But eventually, something else that I found very helpful for me, it was, oh, I had trained to become a family therapist, but I'll come back to that, my experience as a family therapist. But for my own personal development, for my own dealing with this inherited trauma, I found family constellations really helpful. Now, the reason I found family constellations very helpful is because they have a way of being able to acknowledge and identify where the trauma is held in one system. So there's an appreciation that we are more than our life experiences. You know, that we hold generations of experiences in our system. And that really resonated for me strongly. And so I stayed with that for some time. I found that very helpful. So like I say, I had to find my way and feel my way. I think these days there's so much more available. First of all, there is such an appreciation of trauma being held in the body. Now, of course, we take that for granted. But remember 30, 40 years ago, when I was working as a psychotherapist, I couldn't get anyone to talk to me about the body in psychotherapy. You know, the idea that I might be putting my hands on my patients was, I don't know, unethical. 30 years ago, you understand, 25 years ago. Times have changed.
So before we get into talking about your work as a therapist, it sounds like you're saying that talk therapy can only do so much when it comes to healing trauma and inherited family pain. Is that true?
Well, everyone will have to find their own way. But of course, psychotherapy isn't for everyone. Of course, it's not for everything. You know, psychotherapists, we have words, and those are our tools, and we use empathy. We have all sorts of things that we have in our toolkit. And of course, I'm a psychotherapist. Of course, I want to encourage people to, you know, seek psychotherapy if they need it. But, you know, you also have to realize that psychotherapy has its limits. You know, people have to find their own way. I certainly had to find my own way. And for a period of time, even in my practice, I combined psychotherapy with the Alexander technique, which is more of a mind-body focus, because I found that some people, we just needed to focus on the body for some time, and then we could come back and into the mind. But when unconscious experiences, you see, let me explain, when unconscious experiences are held in the body, as so much trauma is, they can't be thought about. They're not in the mind, they're in the body. So they can't be thought about. But psychotherapy is about thinking things through. And so when we do body work, of course, it's an opportunity to free some of these experiences from our body so they can come into engage in our mind so we could think and then process. Do you understand?
Yes.
So they can work alongside. And in my practice for some years, I worked in that way. Or for some people, they might be in psychotherapy for many years and they find that actually they just don't shift, even though they have so much insight and nothing much happens. Well, sometimes what's needed, I've found just in my experience, again, just finding my own way, that sometimes they haven't been able to integrate it because it hasn't penetrated their body. So we have to come back to body work to really let it penetrate and integrate. So the whole body mind thing comes into play.
Yes, yes. So it sounds like you found your way into psychotherapy rather accidentally. I know that you were a stand-up comedian for years. How did you make the segue from being a stand-up comedian to being a professional full-time psychotherapist? And why were you drawn to that?
How was I drawn to that? I was always drawn to psychotherapy. I started off, by the way, as an occupational therapist working in mental health. So that's how I got into psychotherapy, because I worked in the psychotherapy unit as an occupational therapist, and the health authority where I was working trained me as a family therapist. And then later I trained at the Tavistock. So I have done quite a lot of psychotherapy training. I was always attracted to it. And I only now can reflect back and understand that I was probably trying to obviously heal something in my own family and also looking for a lost family. I found that I could just work easily with families, and I did for many years. So I was probably somewhere looking for a lost family of my own somewhere too. But I've found, all I can say is I found psychotherapy and family therapy incredibly natural, incredibly natural. And where that comes from, I can't explain, except to say that perhaps my first patient was perhaps my mother. And perhaps that's why I found it so incredibly easy and so incredibly natural. But even with psychotherapy and my style of working, I also felt a need to find my own way. I wanted to work in a particular way. And at that time, psychotherapy just wasn't going in that direction. I was going one way. And so again, obviously, always looking for my own way.
Right. So in a family, when you're working as a therapist with a family that has a lot of trauma within it, do you work individually with the family members, or do you work with them together as a group?
Well, keep in mind, I just have to say, now I haven't worked as a family therapist for over 10 years, maybe 12 years, because my work has changed. It's more business focused now, as you know. So I'm going back in time, but I did work with families together. But I'm always very open and flexible. And if at times, if there's a need to see somebody individual or this particular pair or just this three or perhaps everyone together, we'd have to see how it goes, but often the whole family at once. And, I oftentimes saw the best of family life, not the worst, because remember, I saw people and families who would do anything, to help their members, people in the family. And that was extraordinary to see that kind of love and commitment and dedication of this group, this family coming together to family therapy. Can you imagine what a commitment that is and how much love and care goes behind that decision? So even though I saw families with big, big problems, I also saw families that cared a lot too.
And in the family system, when you're working with a family with a lot of pain and grief, do the parents, for example, need to take responsibility before the child can heal?
Well, I think it's always bad if parents blame themselves. It's never helpful or useful or at all. Do they have to take responsibility? No. We have to understand the whole system. And the way we work as a family therapist is nobody necessarily at fault or responsible, because it's a whole system that everybody plays a part of. So it's not as if one person is identified as being responsible. I don't think that's ever helpful. However, I have noticed over the years in my work that for individuals, for adults who haven't resolved something in themselves, their children carry some of that. So oftentimes what I've said to people over the years, the best thing you can do for your children is to work on yourself. Because what's unresolved for you will likely, look, children are very, very helpful. As I was a helpful child, I guess that's one way of putting it. Children are helpful and I was helpful. And children quite naturally will want to ease their parents of their anxiety and unconsciously take it on as their own, somehow believing that if they hold this anxiety, that their parents will be free of it. And if the parents are free of their anxiety, then hopefully they'll be better parents too. Of course, that's never the case. And so what we find is the children hold this anxiety. And of course, parents still have it. And all that's happened is there's just more anxiety in the family. So it is the case that I think children are super helpful and try to carry this for their parents.
I work with a lot of people who come from families where there was a lot of addiction and or abuse. So I'm asking, if there's abuse in a family, let's say that one of the parents is an active alcoholic and or there's sexual impropriety in the house, is it necessary for the perpetrator in a family therapy situation to take some responsibility for what they have done before the child can release their own grief and trauma?
No, not necessarily. Not the child, yes. But if the person comes to you, I assume that person is now grown up and coming to you as an adult. Is that right? This now is theirs. It was their parents, but now it's theirs. And
even if there was abuse in the family.
I think that sometimes what people have to face, which is really terribly painful, is I think the grief that their parents have never been able to heal, or their parents have never been good parents. I find that's a theme that many people have to come to face in the course of their own therapy. This grief that their parents never were or ever will be, that they will never have the parents they wish they had, that they never had maybe. And I think for some people that is a big something to face. And I know many people keep thinking, oh, my parents have to change first, they have to change and they have to change. But, the individual might be left with the reality that, their parents hasn't been. And, it's the hardest thing for a child to have to face sometimes is that their own parents have harmed them.
Yes.
That's really terribly sad for a person to have to face that truth. A child will go to incredible lengths and even make themselves at fault, of course, or be the bad one. Do you understand? In order not to believe that this parent who they entirely depend on could harm them, and yet they have. And that's something I think individuals that come from abused family oftentimes have to face.
I've known many people who were held hostage by their own anger and their own blame toward their parents, and said that they can't let it go until there's some acknowledgement of what has happened, which of course is a trap, because there's no guarantee you'll get that acknowledgement, and nor is it necessary. Perhaps that's what I hear you saying. Is that we don't need the apology, for example, from the parent. For us to heal. It's more about accepting that what has happened, what has lost is lost, and that we will never have parents who might, be able to give us that kind of that kind of, apology or awareness of what has gone down.
That's right. Well, some people, it works the other way around because some people want to hold their parents hostage forever too.
That's true. And that's absolutely a part of that dynamic.
That's right. And they want to punish their parents. How do you live with that? I don't have an answer. How do you live knowing that the people whose your life was in their hands harmed you, or weren't interested in you, or neglected you? It's a terrible truth. And yet, if that's one's reality, then that is the reality and needs to be faced. But of course, there's the opportunity for having different kinds of relationships. And then what it means for the individual is, well, then how do you love? And then
can you say more about that? You mean different kinds of relationships with others or within the family?
Well, with others, if it's not possible in the family, they can create their own family. I've times talked to people about that. They don't have the same kind of family. They can be determined to have a different kind of family. And then it's a process about learning how to love differently and learning how to care differently. So that won't, for many people, come naturally. But of course, these things can be learned.
Yeah. And tell me, as a therapist and as someone who's come through what you came through as a child, how do you feel about the notion of forgiveness? What does forgiveness mean to you? Is it necessary? Is premature forgiveness helpful? What do you think about forgiveness from a clinical standpoint?
From a clinical point of view, it's not a theme that I introduce a lot. I think it's something that either comes naturally for individuals. I certainly don't prescribe to a process. Well, I don't prescribe to a process about many things, but I certainly don't suggest there's a process toward forgiveness, or I never suggest that people should forgive, or that somehow they're less well because they haven't forgiven. I mean, I think it is a natural outcome out of people's process. They've done some work and then something's fun, or they don't, and that's absolutely fine too. I guess what I don't like to hear about is the guilt people feel because they're not able to forgive.
Yes. Feeling like, what's wrong with me that I can't let this go, but they can't. Yeah. Or just let it be. They somehow can't do that, and so it becomes a double wounding.
That's right. So I think this way of just being able to, accept that this is where I am, and this is the result of so much. One of the things that I've experienced, I've done so many things over the years to understand what it means to be human and overcome trauma. And, it's been such a lifetime journey for me. But I guess I've also come to appreciate how complex we all are. There aren't any kind of simple solutions. But sometimes people can hang on to something as if, if I could learn to forgive, then I would be free. Well, maybe you can forgive and maybe you still don't feel free. That we are so complex. And, as I described in my experience, I held so much of my family's trauma in me, and God knows what else I'm holding inside myself. And we'll never know entirely how much we carry, but we certainly carry more. I've certainly learned that we certainly carry more than what we've experienced in our lifetimes. We certainly hold a lot more than that. And we can only now, I think, tap into that. So we're always working with so many unknowns, and we do the best we can. And I think psychotherapists do a super job, by the way. I hope I'm not saying anything to discourage people from psychotherapy. I want to encourage it. There's so many good things. I think the intention to sit down in a relationship and want to examine and to understand and to heal and make better. Well, those are such great things. And we don't know everything.
Right. So now you've moved into another complex field, which is the workplace, and how we import our issues, including family issues, into the dynamics of where we work. First, I'd like to know, how were you drawn into this kind of work, and why is it so fascinating to you?
Well, I love it. Well, many, many years ago, I had people, my psychotherapy practice, come and talk to me about work. And I found it really interesting then. Again, this was quite some time ago, so we might be going back about 15 years. Sometimes people in family, anyway, they came and they talked about work. And what I always found very interesting is I noticed that people were reenacting their family dramas in the workplace a lot. And oftentimes more so than even in their own families. And this is what I found is really striking, because people talk about repeating their parents' relationship or being a mother like their mother wasn't, and everybody is quite willing to appreciate that they're recreating their family lives in their personal relationships and their families, but nobody was talking about work, and they're still not talking enough about work. So I found that fascinating. And the other thing I found fascinating about work is, in a work situation, not only are people reenacting their family dramas in the workplace, and there's so much unconsciously being acted out at work, but people having to face things that are deeply uncomfortable for them. And at work, they can't be avoided. Of course, in personal relationships, people are able to walk away from personal relationships, but you're at a job, there are things you have to face, and it's really challenging. So work, I find, is psychologically an incredibly challenging arena for people. And so I began to write about this and discovered there was a huge interest. I've been writing for the Financial Times about this for 10 years or so, about this particular theme, the psychodynamics of work, and recently written a book on the similar topic, The Man Who Mistook His Job for His Life, which paperback is coming out next month. If you don't mind, I'll plug it quickly and say the new title is Work Therapy, easy to remember. So that's my focus now. What happens to people at work?
What are the most difficult types of issues in the workplace to get underneath and expose? Are there particular personality types or particular kinds of dynamics that are especially challenging to use your work on?
Well, everything is challenging. I think what happens for people at work is things like difficult conversations, being ignored at work, not promoted, not acknowledged, all the things that happen at work all the time, every day, where people can feel very traumatic if it touches a nerve or something that's unresolved in them. So the main thing that happens is situations are always misread, and people start to confuse. They think they start to treat or feel towards their boss as a parent. Of course, boss is not, but it can feel that way, sort of thing. So I find that people, when they come to see me, they're hugely open, because these strategies that they're engaged in, they're causing so many problems at work, and they have to fix it. I mean, work isn't a place, it's not psychotherapy in the sense, there's not that time to spend examining, unpicking, unraveling. Let's look at this and let's look at, you have to get to work here and learn very quickly and change work habits very quickly and do things differently. Otherwise, there are going to be problems. So people are, I think, more motivated to make these connections and do things differently. But I mean, we're talking about an individual who has some level of psychological awareness and also maturity to be able to do that. But you asked something else. You asked about challenging people. And I guess challenging people would be those people who I guess are more what I call extreme personalities. Extremely paranoid, extremely narcissistic, extremely borderline, those sorts of personalities, which I call extreme, that have on the extreme end, these are individuals that oftentimes have no insight, really imagine that the problems aren't coming from inside of them, but they're actually, it's everybody else's fault, sort of thing. My work is very much about, let's be clear about your experience internally, what's going on with you and how you're acting this out in this workplace and how you can take responsibility for what's happening. But people on the extreme end of personality disorder thinking, don't really have that insight. They really deeply believe that there is nothing inherently about them that's worth examining, that the problem lies outside of them. So that is extremely challenging. And oftentimes I'm not working with them because they don't think they have a problem, of course. So they're not coming to see me, but there are the people that they're victimizing who are coming to see me a lot.
Right. Just one last question, Naomi. I know that you have a spiritual practice. You have a long-standing meditation practice. I know that you've studied the Course of Miracles. Can you say something about how you integrate spirituality, perhaps not ever mentioning the word, into the healing work that you do with people, not only in the workplace, but in families?
Well, spirituality has been and is such a big part of my life that there's nothing I do that isn't spiritual, because it becomes so who I am. So it's such a difficult question for me to answer because I'm just so deeply spiritual, and my spiritual life is just so important to me. And it's been so crucial in my healing and continues to be. So I bring myself in everything I do, and I am spiritual, and that's what I do.
Do you ever recommend that people meditate? Do you recommend that people, start, look for deeper meaning or a higher power? Is that part of the language that you use in working with people?
Not normally, because I'm not a spiritual teacher. I'm not. I'm what I call myself now is I'm a business psychotherapist. I help people with business problems. I do executive coaching. So oftentimes my work is also very pragmatic. We have big problems to solve, and so I'm not a spiritual teacher, but certainly there are times where I think meditation might really be helpful, that I would encourage people to meditate. I don't think that's unusual. I think in business these days, there's a lot of encouragement for people to meditate. So I think that's a great thing. I think if people can do one thing, meditate.
Good. Well, Naomi, I want to just thank you so much. And now, folks, a bit of disclosure. Naomi and I have known each other for over 50 years. She's one of my oldest and dearest friends. And one of the reasons that we bonded as 12 or 13-year-old kids in California was that we were both growing up in these severely traumatizing environments. So although we never talked about it, when I look back now, I can see that we were kindred spirits. So it's amazing to me to see where we've both come to. And it's such a joy for me, Naomi, to see how you have thrived and flourished. I want to encourage everybody to buy Naomi's book. Tell us again the new title for the paperback.
The paperback title is Work Therapy, or The Man Who Mistook His Job for His Life.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Naomi Shragai. It's great to see you as always. And thanks for joining us at the Seekers Forum.
My pleasure. Lovely to see you.